Yo, what's good everyone? The banners have been announced for the first half of 5.2 and Heizou, Sergeant Shitpants himself, is finally back. We'll gladly trade him for that diabolical birthday art to be released that one time. We're going to look at a timeline of how Heizou's improved since his release, and we'll use it to inform us on how to build him and his teams for 5.2, including his synergy with the new 4-star Auroron. So Detective Diarrhea is an Animo DPS who deals the majority of his damage with his skill. Both his skill and burst deal a big instance of Animo damage, but his skill deals even more when he has 4 stacks. He gets a stack whenever he triggers Swirl and another from his C1 when he switches in. So if you switch in with his burst, that's a stack from his C1 and another for triggering Swirl. A couple swirls later, which you can do with 2 normal attacks if you have off-field units applying elements, he'll have 4 stacks which gives him maximum damage on his skill. His skill also increases the rest of the team's elemental mastery by 80. But not his for some reason. I guess Hoyoverse don't like the shit pants either. Looking quickly at his constellations, cause one alludes to a playstyle, his C1 increases normal attack speed by 15%. This means, running him as an on-field driver, he can trigger off-field damage quicker for units like Xingqiu, Yilan, Beidou or C6 Fischl who all attack in sync with the on-fielder's normal attacks. His C2 increases the strength of the crowd control from his burst. But I didn't mention it earlier cause the crowd control's weaker than his fashion sense. His C3 gives him 3 levels on his skill, his C4 makes his burst refund energy, his C5 gives him 3 levels on his burst, and his C6 gives him crit rate and crit damage on his skill. So there are 3 main roles for the Poo Police: on-field driver, on-field DPS, and a sub-DPS support. To clarify, being a DPS means the character deals damage themselves. Being a driver means they act on-field to enable others to deal damage off-field. Even on release, Heizou could make use of these roles in different ways. As an on-field DPS, people used him in vape teams with Xiangling, Bennett, and then one of Xingqiu or Yilan. These teams weren't awful, but with characters like Child, there were just better options. In fact, he functioned better as a sub-DPS support in the Child national team. He'd hold 4-piece Viridescent Venera to shred the opponent's resistance in the same way Sucrose or Kazuha would, and he also buffs the team's elemental mastery with his passive. He's useful in this role for filling some of the downtime on Child's skill too. Sticking with the sub-DPS support role, people sometimes used him in freeze teams. Ayaka was one of the top tier DPSs back then, one of Rosaria or Shenhe for the other cryo slot for the cryo resonance, then you just need one of Kokomi, Mona or Xingqiu for the hydro slot. Giving him thrilling tales was useful for Ayaka, but realistically, Kazuha is still better in this role. Heizou's most popular use was, and probably still is, as an on-field driver in electrocharge teams. The biggest issue with electrocharge is it scales off the elemental mastery of whoever triggers it, but with hydro and electro application being so constant, you never know who is triggering it and who to build elemental mastery on. Shitlock Holmes solves the case as per usual by giving the entire team 80 elemental mastery with his passive. His C1 increases attack speed as mentioned earlier, which benefits Xingqiu, Yilan, Fischl and Beidou, with Viridescent Venera shredding opponent resistances and even Hakushin Ring giving a damage bonus to Electro and the element it reacts with. Heizou is a solid driver. He was usable when he launched but has improved with the release of newer units, weapons and now some changes to reaction multipliers, so let's look at these buffs. 3.0 gave us Dendro. Did it do much for Heizou? Not really, but it's usable. If you have him on a full elemental mastery build, you can run him with Fischl, Dendro and a Hydro unit and trigger Hyper Bloom with his Electro Swirls. Alternatively, you could swap the Hydro unit for another Electro unit and trigger Aggravate with him instead. Layla's release in 3.2 gave Heizou another option as an on-field DPS. Let's say you didn't want to run Bennett and would prefer a Shielder. Layla provides Cryo application, can hold 4-piece Tenacity to give him and the team attack, and a C4 gives him a little damage boost too. She could even hold Freedom Swan to give the team attack and Heizou some normal attack damage, and now she can hold Shallona's weapon to give the team elemental damage. The Toothpaste Archon Farazan buffs Heizou as a DPS too. She does require constellations, but if you have a C6 you're in luck. She reduces the enemy's resistance to Animo, buffs Heizou's Animo damage, offers a little crowd control and energy, 40% crit damage from his C6, and can even hold 4-piece tenacity or noblesse if you don't have a holder in the team. 4.0 gave us 2 new artifact sets with Golden Troop and Marechaussee Hunter. With most of his damage coming from his skill, some Theory crafters found 4-piece Golden Troop to be his best set as an on-field DPS. Marechaussee Hunter became viable on him when Farina dropped. She was a buff to everyone to be honest, but Heizou benefits a lot from her. She provides another source of damage which helps because he doesn't exactly deal hypercarry damage himself, and she buffs his damage across the board with her fanfare. With the release of Xian Yun, everyone became a plunge DPS, which is fitting for Heizou because he went from being a shit to being a plunger. Farina would take one slot and then one of Bennett or Farazan would grab the other. It's worth noting that with him being Anemo, he reduces Xian Yun's energy recharge requirements slightly and lets her run a bit more attack. This benefits the plunge shockwave buff from a passive as well as a healing. Generally speaking, every mono element DPS released since Heizou is a buff because he can fulfill the Kazuha role of holding Viridescent Venera. He isn't as good as Kazuha because of a weaker grouping and he doesn't buff elemental damage, but he deals a bit of damage himself and can hold a good amount of support weapons. Keep this in mind because we'll expand on them in a minute. This next one technically isn't a buff, but in a way it is. Imaginarium Theatre gave him another use. Realistically, he's not competing with the best DPSs in the Abyss, and if you use him as a sub-DPS to shred elements in mono teams, he's not competing with Kazuha. With Imaginarium Theatre having the 2-use limit for each character, he's useful for filling an extra space while not being a detriment to the team. I found him to actually be useful in there. As you may have heard, 5.2 is going to buff some reactions which makes his electro-charged teams even stronger. On top of that, should there ever be an off-field cryo unit that comes out tailored towards superconduct damage rather than the physical resistance shred, Heizou will pair well with them. Auroron gives him another teammate for Taser. He has more AoE than Fischl, so you can maybe make a pair with him and Beidou, and he also holds 4-piece scroll to buff electro and hydro damage. If you can get his C6, it'll give Heizou up to 30% attack too, which is appreciated. Okay, so we've looked at how he's been buffed since his release, and along the way we've looked at his teams. Now let's look at how you should build him. Just a reminder, there are 3 roles: on-field DPS for his damage, on-field driver for his teammates' damage, and sub-DPS support. For the on-field DPS role, give him either 4-piece Golden Troop, 2-piece Viridescent Venera 2-piece attack, or if you're running in with Farina, 4-piece Marechaussee. For weapons, anything with attack or crit will do, but surprisingly, the Theory crafters at Kerching mains have Skyward Atlas as his best in slot. Lost Prayer is solid, Yai's weapon is strong too, but you get a skill damage buff every time you use his skill, which can stack 3 times and last 16 seconds, but he has a 10-second cooldown on his skill, so you're not getting the full use out of it. I'm not a fan of Widsith, but a lot of people use that on him. Don't sleep on the Fontaine craftable. Definitely the free-to-play choice, has a high base attack, also has attack as the secondary stat, and the passive gives him up to 40% elemental damage. It just requires you to heal away a bond of life it puts on him. As an on-field driver, you want to use 4-piece Viridescent Venera, but instead of using attack, anemo damage and crit like you do in his DPS build, you give him full elemental mastery. Sacrificial Fragments gives a lot of elemental mastery as well as another use of his skill. When Heizou triggers an electro reaction while holding the Inazuma craftable Hakushin Ring, it buffs the team's electro damage and whichever other element was involved in the reaction. Wandering Evenstar, if you have it, gives the entire team attack, scaling off his elemental mastery. For the sub-DPS support role, you can go with the same artifacts, but definitely try and give him a support weapon. Hakushin Ring, as I mentioned, is good in teams with electro. Thrilling Tales is good for buffing an attack scaler. Wandering Evenstar for attack for the team. Prototype Amber's a decent choice if you're comfortable without a dedicated sustain unit. And Favonius Codex is good for feeding energy to the team, but make sure to give him a little crit rate. Overall, Heizou isn't the best DPS in the game, but he is versatile. He can be used as the on-field driver for reaction-based teams, an on-field DPS dealing a lot of the team's damage himself, or a sub-DPS with some support potential too, depending on the artifact set and weapon you give him. I definitely think he's worth building with Imaginarium Theatre requiring so many built characters. He's a useful one to drop in there when you need to fill spaces. I dropped guides for Auroron and Chaska last weekend, as well as a video on 10 units getting buffed in 5.2, including Heizou. Subscribe to the channel if you're interested in them, and take it easy.